And so when I was thinking of these topics of inclusion and belonging, I naturally reflected on my own experience. And for those of you who know me, know that I was born in Iran in the mid-80s after the 79 Islamic Revolution, which changed the fabric of Iranian society in quite terrifying ways. And for those in the room who experienced that, we know that it has its lasting effects to this day. And for the Baha'is, where there was great persecution, which my parents and my family members also suffered, they made the unimaginable choice, and actually choice is not the right word, but they escaped Iran. And I was just around 1, my brother was around 3, and my mother at the time rode camelback, walked, dodged gunfire to get us safely to Pakistan, where my father had gone a few months earlier to ensure that the passage was safe. And after a period of time in Pakistan and we received refugee status, we were resettled in New Zealand. And you can imagine, or maybe you can't, but let me paint a picture of what it might have been like for a young Iranian family which has a mixed Turkish-Kurdish heritage to arrive in the South Island, in cold, windy, old city of Dunedin, also very small city, and far from the cultural dynamism and landscape of Iranian society. So already from that moment, there is an encounter, right? There's an encounter with your environment, there's an encounter with people, and these questions of who am I, do I belong, am I acceptable come to, and accepted come to the fore. Now, fast forward a couple of decades, and I find myself in Turkey, the country of Turkey, and I'm interviewing and meeting individuals who had fled the conflict in Syria, which we would call them Syrian refugees. And there you would say, well, the culture can't be so dissimilar to that in Syria. And yet we would have conversations and mothers would talk about how they cannot take their children to school because they would be ridiculed on the one hand for wearing a hijab, on the other hand for not wearing it, depending on which family you're talking to. So if you know about Turkey, it went through a period of intense secularization, and then now there's also pockets of religious fanaticism. So there's a lot of, in a sense, turmoil and a pull and push. So culture and markers of a person's identity suddenly take a whole new meaning when you're a refugee from a neighboring country, but in a country that doesn't speak your language and is questioning whether you should be there. Then in Jordan, I remember meeting this young Syrian youth, and as we went to go meet him, we had to climb up about 4 stories in this derelict, seemingly abandoned apartment building. We finally got to the top of this building and I saw him, and I saw that he had a walking stick and a leg that was very roughly bandaged up. But he was so excited to see us. And then when we went in and he told me his story, he said that he was still suffering from a gunshot wound to his leg, and they had given him this room on the top of this building with no elevator. No one would visit him unless they were checking to see if he had died yet. He was very lonely. Then fast forward about 2 years, and I find myself in Berlin, Germany, you know, the city of libertarian values, of art and culture, youth, a lot of dynamism. And as you also will probably know, Germany accepted a large number of Syrian refugees. I also met refugees from Iraq and from Iran and Afghanistan. And I remember asking some of these individuals who had been trying to learn the language, which was a marker of social cohesion or integration in the refugee program in Germany, whether they felt that they belonged. And they said, we try to learn the language, but they won't give us work. So we end up spending time with each other. We don't have any friends who are quote unquote German. Finally, let me transport you now to Oxford in the United Kingdom, the seemingly like center of so-called civilization, a country that has been the cause of great suffering around the world through its colonialization of peoples and lands. And yet in this place, which has become a melting pot of different cultures, in our neighborhood, we held a family camp where we invited our neighbors and our friends, and we said, hey, come together. We want to like learn about community. And there was an East Timorian family that had attended. There were a few actually from East Timor that had attended. And if you know, Portugal had colonized East Timor. And as a sort of a way of, I guess, paying back, they afforded East Timorians a passport. So many East Timorians have used the Portuguese passport to come to Europe and the UK to find work and to live. And this man had lived in the UK for decades. Okay, he was a seasoned Brit, right? And I asked him a very casual question, which you often do at an event. Are you having a good time? And his eyes filled with tears. And he told me about his daughter, who was suffering from a mental illness, and his young son, who he couldn't seem to control. And he said, here we are treated like human beings. And it made me wonder, what had he experienced in this country and in this city of so-called intellectual enlightenment and cultural advancement that made him feel subhuman? So what do all these stories have in common, and why am I sharing them? So let's go back to the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah. And in one of his writings, he surveys the world's problems and he identifies the cause of them. And he says, no two men can be found who may be said to be outwardly and inwardly united. But then he goes on to say, ye are the fruits of one tree and the leaves of one branch. Okay, these may seem like very simplistic statements or analyses of otherwise very complex social, economic, historical, political problems, but let's just indulge this concept in a little bit more detail. His eldest son and the exemplar of his teachings, Abdul Baha, he analyzed this and he said, religionists have considered the world of humanity as two trees, one divine and merciful, the other satanic. But Baha'u'llah is not saying there are two trees. He is saying there's only one tree and all of humanity is on it. And there you will find a number of analogies in the Baha'i writings to try and convey this point of unity and this point of oneness. Humanity can be likened to a human body, or the drops of an ocean, the rays of the sun. And in all these analogies, we might come to get a glimpse of not only our interconnectedness and our interdependence, but of something even deeper, which is our collective spiritual ancestry and therefore our oneness. Baha'u'llah has entirely banished this concept of us and them. There is only us, with a caveat. He also does not banish the beauty of diversity. This oneness does not imply uniformity or sameness. This diversity is what makes the world of humanity beautiful, interesting, fun. But we have lost that over time. Why have we lost it? Where is the disconnect between this reality that humanity is essentially one and the experiences of otherness, of isolation, of discord, of hatred? What happened? Abdu'l-Baha explains very clearly what happened. He says that the breeding ground of all these tragedies is prejudice. Prejudice of race and nation, of religion, of political opinion. And he goes on to explain that the root cause of prejudice is blind imitation of the past. Imitation in religion, in racial attitudes, in national bias, in politics. And he warns us that so long as this aping of the past persisted, just so long will the foundations of the social order be blown to the four winds. Just so long will humanity can be continually exposed to direst peril. So if left unchecked, this prejudice eats into the vitals of society, breaks apart relationships, families, communities, governments. And this is a very significant diagnosis of the world's problems. So I don't know about you all, but I have a feeling that you all know what I mean when we say that this is an experience that we can all see. And if it hasn't been something that we ourselves have experienced, we know of friends, family, colleagues, neighbors who experience bouts of loneliness, isolation, discord. Maybe among us, or at least we know of the poverty and injustices that are going on. And I personally have lived and worked in 9 countries in 5 continents, and it is everywhere. Doesn't matter if it is in Africa or the Middle East, Europe, Asia, Australasia. There is no society that is untouched by these maladies and forms of disconnection. The reason why no one is immune from prejudice is because we all have the need to connect and belong, but we aren't all being educated by the same source, right? So not everyone has been brought up with this concept of this oneness. Not every society or government is instilling this in the hearts and minds of its peoples. And subsequently, we are not being ruled by just leaders globally. On that sober note, there is a path forward. But if we want the right answers, we need to ask the right questions. And for me, having seen the way that challenges to social cohesion have been addressed, which are often addressed in strictly material and physical terms. For example, if they just learn the language, they will be included. If we give them a house, they won't feel alone. If they have work, they will stop complaining. But the question that I would ask is what touches the heart? Because the heart is the seat of these prejudices. And although prejudices manifest themselves practically, economically, and socially, Abdu'l-Baha explains that the spiritual is expressed and carried out in the material. So if we adopt a spiritual lens and draw on spiritual powers and the existence of spiritual virtues, then the material will be a reflection of the spiritual, right? If you take the spiritual lens out of the equation and you only go forth with an extreme materialist approach, then you have the lack of spiritual presence and reflection in the material solutions that you are offering. Baha'u'llah has come with a very specific purpose. He has come to bring about the reality of the oneness of humanity by creating a community that helps to restore the equilibrium of the world which has been lost. It is a group of people, us, all of us, you don't have to have the name Baha'i. He is creating a group of people who are inspired and influenced by the spirit of the age with which he has come, to live in a certain way, to have a certain consciousness, and who will play a part in contributing to this change. And he sums it up in one idea. Well, my thought is that he sums it up in one idea. And he says that we should prefer others over ourselves. This isn't the golden rule, where the golden rule says to treat others the way you would want to be treated. Okay, Baha'u'llah expands this. He extends it. He challenges us. He says, prefer others to yourselves. He guides us to strive to be shining examples unto all mankind and true reminders of the virtues of God amidst men. What are some of those virtues? What does that mean, the virtues of God? To be generous in prosperity, thankful in adversity, to be worthy of the trust of thy neighbor, and to look upon him with a bright and friendly face. And it goes on and on and on. And we must take this seriously. And if we realize that this guidance goes wider and deeper than simply being nice or being polite, right? It doesn't imply tolerance. It's something much more profound. It means that we must be so overwhelmed by our love for others that it is our reflection of our love for our Creator, that we were created out of love, we were created to love. We are called to not be content with showing friendship in words alone, but to let our hearts burn with loving kindness for all who may cross our path. This is a fundamentally different way of seeing others in a community, in a neighborhood, at work, at the supermarket. It's not about merely saying nice things. It's not about using slogans. If we put this in practice, we will witness transformation. And transformation is different from change. Change, when something changes, you can still see the remnants of what was before, and the ability to go back to that is possible. A transformation is the creation of an entire new entity, and an entire new reality is formed. I'll give one example. Okay. Let's go into, sometimes it gets very meta and I get that, but let's look at one example. So in India, many of you will know this already, there is a deeply ingrained prejudice, a cultural practice of the caste system. Okay, so if you're not aware of it, very briefly, the caste system divides the population people into 4 or more categories, which are then used as a form of social stratification. So higher castes are considered more superior than lower classes. So you have priests at the top, then warriors, then merchants and landowners, then commoners, peasants and servants, and then even a category for, it's translated in English as the untouchables. Okay, so they may be the street sweepers or the cleaners. I mean, really terrible prejudices. But it is a system that is so deeply ingrained in that society that despite very obvious ramifications of its application, the injustices, the pain, the suffering, the isolation, it persists. And countless NGOs, countless humanitarian agencies with good intentions, with good desires, strive to challenge this issue. So for example, they may afford a microfinancing program to a particular lower caste community so that they can achieve financial autonomy. Or they may give them a piece of land so that they can build a particular community center so that they have a place to gather. But these will only go so far, and in some cases further entrench those caste categories and further divide the community. But in one example that I came across in one of these videos that I was watching, a young mother had come across this teaching of Baha'u'llah for the first time. This teaching of the oneness of humanity. Never heard it before, hadn't been brought up in it. And she understood it at a deeply spiritual level. She was illiterate, so her understanding was not dependent on book learning. And this is often in the West, a prejudice that we hold and that is ingrained in us, that we think that spiritual insight comes from the mind alone. She understood it at the level of the spirit, to such an extent that she promised never to tell her own children which caste they belonged to. And when asked why, she said, "I do not want my children to think they are inferior or superior to anyone else." So do you see how countercultural that is? Even when it would come with severe tests in a context and in an environment where that is the practice, that is the norm, that is the expectation, but it can transform an entire family. And imagine what the ripple effects of that would be. Now, in order for this mother to have come to this understanding and to become a powerful agent of change, she had to embody a fundamental teaching of Baha'u'llah: the independent investigation of truth. Okay, I want to briefly talk about this because it's very important. It's very clear in the Baha'i writings that if we are to turn away from the blind imitations of the past, so if you remember, the cause of the troubles we see are prejudice, okay? Prejudices are the breeding ground of these tragedies. And so if we are to turn away from blind imitation, we must independently investigate truth for ourselves. If we continue to adopt whatever our parents believe, whatever our culture says, whatever it is the norms of our society alone, if that is the thing we do without independently thinking, we will imitate the past. We've seen that happen in various strata of society. But Abdul Baha explains why this is so important. He says that truth is one when it is independently investigated. It does not accept division. Therefore, the independent investigation of truth will lead to the oneness of the world of humanity. Okay, this is deeply profound because on the surface level, it seems contradictory, right? So we all have to seek truth for ourselves, but that will somehow unite us. Won't it just lead to extreme relativism, which is what we see in society? What's true for you is true for you. What's true for me is what's true for me, each to their own. But Baha'u'llah explains that there are two systems of knowledge available to us: science and religion. And if we use these two systems of knowledge to closely and continuously, so this is a process, closely and continuously interact with our quest for truth, then the insights and skills that are obtained will foster oneness. Why? Because we are collectively getting closer and closer to truth when we find points of unity. The key condition of, there's always a condition. The key condition of the search for truth is that it must be a search with the intention to foster human happiness, establish peace, justice, and unity. And if those are the ultimate goals of our quest, then we will find them, because truth is one, right? Okay, almost done. Let's go back to social cohesion a little bit. The reality of the challenges of social cohesion is that we are continuously engaging with diverse populations. Okay, this is also the reality of increased migration, forced or otherwise. And we all have our various experiences. We have our various cultures, viewpoints. These are to be celebrated. These are beautiful. But when we put the oneness of humanity at the center of our hearts, the center of our words and our actions, what we are doing is we are expressing a wider loyalty, and what the Baha'i writings refer to as a larger aspiration than any that has animated the human race. We are told that this principle of oneness of humanity is not a mere outburst of ignorant emotionalism, or an expression of vague and pious hope. Its appeal is not to be merely identified with a reawakening of the spirit of brotherhood and goodwill among men, nor does it aim solely at the fostering of harmonious cooperation among individual peoples and nations. Its implications are deeper. Its message is applicable not only to the individual, but it concerns itself primarily with the nature of those essential relationships that must bind all the states and nations as members of one human family. That passage that I just read, it goes into a lot more detail as to what the oneness of humanity might look like practically if it was to be applied. And it's in this handout that you can look at if you'd like. I just wanted to briefly mention that because I want us to guard away from throwing this concept out like it's a simple one, right? Yeah, we love each other, everything up here, kumbaya. It's not as simple as that. It's a challenge. It's a challenge at once bold and universal. And it represents the consummation of human evolution, and its realization is fast approaching. Now, I'm also well aware that there are many segments of society that do not agree with this, right? We have seen how white supremacy, extreme nationalism, other forms of ingrained prejudices are eating away at these concepts of society, of oneness. But instead of disheartening us, and now that we maybe have a slight glimpse of what this might look like, why this is important, I wonder if we can maybe just have a reflection on us in this room and those of you who have joined online as to where we might go from coming into contact with this concept. Maybe it's our first time hearing it, maybe it's our 100th time, maybe if it went well, a new insight was shared, a feeling maybe. What do you do with that? The first is to remember that this is a process. And Al-Baha tells us that we cannot instantaneously evolve from the nadir of defectiveness to the zenith of righteousness and perfection. It's like the world of humanity is an embryo, and we're chastising humanity and saying, why aren't you walking and eating and talking and on your own? There needs to be an evolution that takes place. But nevertheless, those of us who have come into contact with it, you can't unknow this now, right? We have to commit ourselves to bringing this into reality through every interaction, in every space, in every act, including struggling with our own prejudices, of which we all have, of course, myself included. And to think of it like a ship that has a hole in it, okay? And the water is prejudice, and you're in the ship, and you have a bucket, okay? And you're trying to empty yourself, trying to empty the prejudice out of this ship so you don't sink. But it's constantly coming in because we are organic with our environment. We are constantly told to other. We are put in positions to judge. We have ingrained prejudices from all of our upbringing. It doesn't matter whether you're Persian or Chinese or Indian or Pacific Islander, we all have been given certain prejudices that are in us. And often it's insidious, often it's unconscious, sometimes it's very overt. We have to call ourselves out for it. Finally, I'll just end with this. I don't know what the time, yeah, I'll end now. Abdu'l-Baha addressed a letter to an individual who wanted to serve humanity, right? Which I assume is all of us as well, right? So he addresses this individual in the following words. He says, "O thou who art serving the world of humanity." It's really lovely. It goes on for a while, and then he says, "When ideas and views reach the utmost degree of expansion and attain the age of perfection, then will he," the individual, "be interested in the exaltation of humankind. He will then be the well-wisher of all men and the seeker of the weal and prosperity of all lands." And at the close of this letter, Abdu'l-Baha summons him to the following. He says, "Love ye all religions and all races with a love that is true and sincere, and show that love through deeds and not through the tongue. For the latter hath no importance, as the majority of men are in speech well-wishers, while action is the best." On that note, I was wondering if we could end with a little piece of music, just to help us reflect. So I've asked if she could, and perhaps if while we're, I mean, if you know the words, we can sing along, and if not, then just listen, and that's fine. And perhaps we can just ask ourselves a question, which is, if we embrace the reality of oneness, of our oneness with the us, what would this single idea do to our lives, the lives of those we come across, and our societies?
That we had in mind always for me is a great reminder of what the purpose is, and yeah, what we should put up with this one. You might know this song. It's Roger Bounty, and it's from the writings of Abdu'l-Baha.
Very larger bounty, conceivable than this, that an individual within himself shall find by the confirmed grace of God. He has become the cause of peace and well-being and happiness. He has
Thank you, Khatarajan. That I still call you your Persian name. Means memories. The original name is memories. You know the yeah, beautiful name. So thank you so much for that great presentation and starting with your personal life experience. You know, which was very moving. You know, and I know and I admire your parents so much. You know, for what they have done. It's very unique. You know, to leave a country in that fashion and they come and make a great life and contribution to a new country. And thank you for explaining this complex topic very beautifully. You know, I think you make an excellent lecturer. You know, I would hire you anytime. uh, and uh, and this topic is very complex because, as you mentioned, the surface is simple concept, the unity of mankind, but it actually embraces everything, and that's why it's the core teachings of the Baha'i faith. Everything else revolves around this concept of the unity of mankind. And I often think about it, it's not something that we discover, you know, it has always been there. It's not that Baha'u'llah invented that. The unity of mankind has always been there, intended for mankind from back to several thousand years, you know, to be one. But mankind was never ready for that. We were in tribes, we were in families, we were nomads, we were in cities, we formed nations. And that's where we are now. We know nations, you know, so we associate ourselves with nation. I'm Persian, you're Indian, you're Chinese, you're American. And that's what we're kind of stuck there. We haven't moved. And I think what you explained is that actually this is the process. So we actually need to get to the final stage that was meant to be, destined to be for mankind, but hasn't reached there. And so a lot of the things we need to do is a question of undoing our prejudice. And this is very difficult, very challenging. And as a Baha'i, I always challenge myself to deal with that. So no Baha'i can say that they're perfect and they are prejudice free. We are doing our best. And one of the ways that I imagine is that, I try myself, when I encounter a person, I try to not to see them, you know, as they're tall or short or they're this color or from this country, that. I try to see them as a human being created by God. That's for me the best way to get rid of all these sort of a if you like attachment, the physical things, you know, that makes us judge. Because when you encounter a person, you make immediately a judgment. In psychology, they call it ladder of abstraction because kids are not born by prejudice. You know, all the kids, you know, put them together, they play beautifully. They don't see the color, they don't see nationality or language, they don't recognize, they play beautifully. So what happens through lifetime is a socialization. It starts from home, you know, maybe a joke from parents, and then they go to school, a story from a teacher, and then maybe at church, you know, they hear stories. That's what form our opinion, and then we use that lens to judge other things, you know, so that becomes entrenched. So it's a very entrenched issue for mankind. But thank you for explaining so beautifully. And there's so much to reflect. And I see that you have some handouts for us.
Yeah, I mean, just I wanted to respond to that, if that's possible. While that is true, that we love all people irrespective of these, what you might call like a secondary identity marker, you know, your age, your gender, your race, whatever, because of the prejudices that have been inflicted and experienced in society and throughout humanity's collective evolution. These markers also play a very important role for us to recognize before we can reach that one. So I couldn't get into a whole section on justice, but the Baha'i writings go into justice in incredible detail as a precursor to unity. So I also had a paragraph here about tangata whenua. And I didn't get to it for a number of reasons. Time was one, the other is because I have no authority to speak about it. But it's on my heart. It is on my, and I just, maybe it's just because we might have 2 minutes just to share this reflection that, and it's going to come across as a footnote or a throwaway point that I just like, oh, and by the way, you know, honor it's not that. It's more that one, I don't have any authority. I know that there's going to be a session on Māori spirituality in these seminar series, which I highly recommend you all listen to Huti, who will be speaking on it. But if we were to have any chance of seeing glimpses of the oneness of humanity reflected here in Aotearoa, then the ways in which tangata whenua are seen, revered, honored, exalted has to happen, or the way it's happened has to change. They're the key to that here. And then it's the case no matter where we are in the world. So whether you're in Canada or, you know, no matter where, it's the role of the Indigenous population and the spiritual ancestry that they give to a community. Doesn't matter how multicultural it gets. Like New Zealand's a perfect example of that, right? Like we're a melting pot of X, Y, and Z. And yet, because of these entrenched prejudices and injustices that are being expressed, we will get nowhere until those justices are also remedied. But I won't speak more about that.
That's very.
Oh, and on this, because you had asked last time, if you're interested, I have put a bunch of quotations related to this theme, most of which I referred to in some ways and some of which I didn't at all. And they go into a lot more detail with the references as well, if you have the interest to read more. I didn't hand them out earlier because I didn't want it to be a distraction. If anyone on Zoom wants them, you can email me. Actually, or you can ask Cohesion and I can send it to you, whichever is easier, but I can email it to you, however you'd like to contact. If you'd like the compilation, you can.
I didn't finish thanking you, and I think I want to ask everyone to put their hands together. Very, very inspirational and food for thought for many, many weeks to come. Now we can open for comments, reflections. You know, that music was beautiful. Thank you so much. It's the very first time we had music in these sessions. It's important to have that. And I think you really mentioned so many things that, well, many stories, but I don't want to be there talking here. So I want to hear other people had in our Zoom audiences.
There's a chat function if you want to.
If you want to share something, what it triggered in your head, one of these, either challenge, you know, I always say, even I say in my classes, you don't need to agree with me, whatever I say. You know, usually they think that professor is always right to mind it. No, actually I tell them, make them comfortable, no? You can challenge me, don't assume that whatever I say is right. And I said the same thing to our speaker here, that whatever you hear, don't assume, you know, use your own judgment and share your thinking with us. So here we go. Anyone, please.
I'll say something. So, if you look at the situation now, I mean, or is this for the, you know, the single word, I was saying what's the for the, you know, it's very, very divided. I mean, we see a different country, and also I can see this. So we can see this during the past probably 200 years or 100 years. I mean, this world is changing very quick. I mean, after the first industrial revolution, well, know that in England, I mean, the change everything. I mean, this technology, change of the technology. I mean, the colonialism, of course, rise of the nationalism. So there's some form of the modern nation, and we see the form of the modern America. Yeah, and also, I think the change is good in some ways. And you mean like you see the science and the religions are like the birds of the two wings. But I think also this change is, you know, I think the technology does change our life, but at some way I think it's not very good, because you see the communications and we use the cell phones, and we have laptops and the cell phones, and the technology is you think this really make our life easy. But I think sometimes it's even make our communication even more harder. You see all these weapons. You know, we invented lots of like lots of weapons by the new technologies, and also run the guns and the flying the jet missiles and all these weapons. and the technology is I think we shouldn't say like the technology is yeah is good. It's good in 100%. And we also consider some disadvantages of the use of the technologies. The people are getting now some people in the hospital. I mean, the technology do improving our life quality. But I mean, it doesn't really create a very good environment. And also to see the pollutions and so like the air pollutions and water pollutions. So I mean, what do you mean? My question is so. What you see the science and religion, and what do you mean by the science? Yeah, there's lots of definition you can say is science. Science is not just the modern technologies. Yeah, science is more than that.
That's a great question, which I have. So, Dear Tiger asked around what do we mean by science as a system of knowledge and practice, that when Baha'u'llah says that there's these two systems, science and religion, what do we mean by science? If science has done both good and bad things for society, right? So I was thinking like, because essentially you're asking about modernity, like modern, like life, right? And one of the founding fathers of the discipline of sociology, which is one of the areas that I had studied, Weber, if you're German. My husband would be very disappointed that I mispronounced that. He's German, so that's the context. Anyway, but Weber says that modernity, he defines modernity as a disenchantment from the mystical realms or the mystical world. In other words, its modernity has been born out of getting rid of religion, a decline of religion. And then as a result of that, it's like the same thing of like, you can have a lamp and the lamp can be the most beautiful lamp and you can design it and it can be, and for the designers in the group, you can just make the most epic lamp ever, right? But if you don't have light inside that lamp, it won't fulfill its function. It would just be this dead entity that sort of sits there. It might be beautiful. It might even be just, you might have made it with actually like toxic materials and it becomes something that's actually really bad for people. So the material in itself does not mean anything, or it could be something very bad for people. But if we add this light, so that's why they go together. The material and the spiritual have to go hand in hand, rather than the extreme of one or the other. If you have the extreme of materialism, we see the effects of that. If you have the extreme of religion without science, you have the extremes of fanaticism, superstition, dogma, and all of the effects that has had. So, I mean, absolutely, like technology is not a value-free kind of thing. It reflects the values of the society and the people that are making and engaging with it. So if we have a lack of spirituality imbuing the creation and use of technology, then we have the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and you have, pollution, and you have et cetera, et cetera. But I'm sure others will have a much more enlightened reflection on this. Any other questions?
Yes, thanks for that. Another way you can think about science and religion is to think about reason and belief. There is a sense in the world that today everything, if we can come to reason logically, we can analyze things, we can actually come to understand something by logic, or by knowledge, then that's truth, So people actually, especially in secular society, they're dismissing belief. And if I believe in something, say, well, maybe it's not that intellectual or educated. And I can see that the universities, actually people hide away from that. And people are actually afraid or feel embarrassed to say, I believe in God. I believe in my religion. People are hiding that. A lot of them, I know in their heart, they do that. But there's nothing wrong with that, So what Baha'i faith teaches is that these two can be actually harmonized together. You need both of them, none with the other. You need to use your mind, you can use your logic, you can use the intellect, power of intellect, and also the belief, because we have so many things, cannot be explained by science. For example, love, how can you describe love, in a lab, what is made of, but everyone feels that, every villager in the world feels that. That's from a sense that the word, the knowledge system is a good word. It's a different way of knowing. And actually, Abdul Baha talks about 5 different ways you can know something. So I think you can use either knowledge and religion. That's one way. The other one, parallel way, is reason and belief. Both of them are valid ways.
We have a contribution on the chat as well.
Eyesight is
just one moment, Tiger. Just there's a few quotes here, but one of them. How do I go down? By nature, not that one. That's not the one I want.
Also really thinking of something. What communities help us. The culture that I knew, and I'm familiar with a number of other cultures, that experienced a lot of scientific phenomena. They had a lot of superstition. For example, you know, they thought that if it rains on a certain day, something bad is going to happen. They thought if you know, a foreigner came to your city and there was a drought, you know, they brought bad omen. You know, there was some religious, you know, fables and so on. It was the idea that somebody was so powerful that with their sword, they, you know, they cut the moon into 2 parts. You know, this is like in their religious, you know, beliefs of some religions, and so there was a lot of superstition that affected people, and it also divided people. And one of them was also racial prejudice. The idea that some races are much better than others, they're brighter, they're better, they're higher level of humanity, and so on. And then science has helped us, you know, to prove more and more and more that there's really no distinction as such. And then, or for example, about men and women and their abilities and their intellectual powers and so on. So I think as we progress with science, it is also shown that you know, there's no distinction. Science has helped us find out that there's really no physical hell or heaven up in the sky. So I think also what I have learned from these ideas is that science can also help us come to this truth. And a part of that truth is that all humanity is really one. So science can help us with that.
Just if I could just add to that point, also the value in when religion is in our lives at a certain point, as in technology, as you mentioned, we're talking about the modern day where the world is rapidly growing, rapidly increasing in numbers. Religion is there in a time for us to understand it in the time we are in, right? There's past religions and how they've adapted and how they've become one with that time. And I feel like the High Faith encourages or speaks upon religion, technology, science, all going hand in hand because it's needed in this time. You can take the negatives out of everything. You can use things in extreme in anything. Technology can be used for good and bad, but if it's used for the purpose of keeping up, you know, per se, in the world we live in today, how else would we do it? You know, how else would we, not only just for religion, but the purpose of communication and the faith really believes in that too, right? Going hand in hand with how we should communicate and how we should adapt to the time we're in order for things to progress. So using that as a tool.
So I know what you say, but we also can see some of these the science are very, you know, I think science is also a very good tool. But I think on the other side, the science, I think that we should all be concerned about this. So science itself. Sometimes we also think this racial prejudice something, or sometimes cultures and they do not allow to the very, you know, very old beliefs that very limits us, you know, getting to know more knowledge on science. But also, I think we're also kind of concerned about the science itself. Sometimes it's already become a form of the worship, and the worship is not something, it's not a good thing. But because I think this So it is about so it's called a worship of the material worship. The science itself is becoming like it is like a thing. Yeah, and we're also the science. The Western theory, the Western theorists, the Western people, and they always think the human is we should be we should believe in everything about the science, and we shouldn't. Religion is nothing. They sort of got in another room and they say science is everything.
That's very true.
It is called the worship of the material.
That's very true.
The science can so we also can I think this is also a concern.
Thank you so much, Heather. So sorry, there was just a quotation that Ashish shared that he said, religion must conform to reason and be in accord with the conclusions of science. For religion, reason, and science are realities. Therefore, these three, being realities, must conform and, sorry, I'm not used to this laptop, must conform and be reconciled. A question or principle which is religious in its nature must be sanctioned by science. Science must declare it to be valid and reason must confirm it in order that it may inspire confidence. Anyway, but you can go and have a look at that in more detail. And there's a question here, but if anybody else has a question.
If I had an email address. So this question is inspired by the concept of it just got me thinking about the concept of the Indian caste system. I am Indian, so it was just interesting to reflect on, and I just sort of pondered, how does one explain or behave towards someone in a situation where their beliefs are counter to the principle of oneness? So I know that with Hinduism, there are, I feel that the caste system is manifest of the various political factions in India, and that leaders just continue to perpetuate that sort of thing. And then with your point, when you're talking about, our tribal affiliations and our ethnic affiliations, we get used to thinking a certain way. And so, but then the religion itself, like I'm just talking about Hinduism, there's other principles of, they reflect on oneness and what that might mean, and, enlightenment as a humanity. So I'm just wondering, how can one approach another person when, they care for these ideals, but then at the same time, some of their beliefs and some of their attitudes and the way they're behaving might actually be intolerant. And I think I'm definitely speaking to my own personal experiences, because I know recently I've had a few conversations with people and I felt that, actually I could have been a little bit more softer in my approach, but actually at the same time, I think I was inspiring some thought on, seeking that understanding of oneness. So I'm just kind of trying to reconcile with that. Yeah.
So there was a point that I get to which was about how we create environments where certain conversations can take place that are obviously very uncomfortable or are challenging to a culture or something that's ingrained in people. So there's like lots of like approaches in the Baha'i faith specifically, everything from like the tongue is a smoldering fire and excess of speech a deadly poison. So there's this idea of like, on one hand, our tongue, our words can have that counter effect that you maybe are referring to, where it can close hearts off or it can offend the heart. And then when the heart is offended, then the mind is closed, right? Because it's like a basic human, what do you call it? A human, safety, what's the animal instinct of? Survival mechanism is the word I'm looking for. It's a survival, like wanting to defend your own. And so on the one hand, there's that. And yet on the other hand, there's the
these concepts of, you know, you offer what you know, that is a particular, maybe it's a teaching, maybe it's an insight, maybe whatever, and you offer it in words as mild as milk, and in a way that will, you know, soften the heart. And if the person rejects it, which is perhaps what you're referring to, you leave it. I mean, there's a difference between the rejection turning into harm, or, you know, if once it boils to that, I think you meet the intolerance with intolerance. You know, there's certain boundaries which should not be crossed. But if we're just talking about a conversation, let's say it's in the family and you disagree with something, culture or whatever, how can we create spaces where we learn how to speak? And because that's the whole point. If that's not what we're doing, then we will see that you'll have more, and I see this all the time, I see it a lot in the race discourse. There has been that institution with races, really impassioned, vital conversation that's taking place. But there are certain concepts and approaches that are reinforcing difference, right? And there's for example, there's clear guidance about from the Universal House of Justice, which is the supreme body of the Baha'i faith, on this race discussion, for example, and talks about how both races or different races need to make a supreme effort. So there also needs to be the will to do that. I want to find, but I don't know if others have thought. Does that? What do you think? What your thoughts? How do you want to have those conversations?
My background. I'm doing my master's. And so, as we're constantly engaged in research about what makes people coexist with each other in a harmonious way. And I mean, it's just a constant question and discussion, and there's no truths. But I mean, I feel that this is, I suppose, the core of it, where I suppose people meet a wall there, and they either crumble, or, I mean, you know, they will very much physically set up a wall if they are intolerant of each other, or, you know, they'll find themselves in conflict, or, you know, so I'm just wondering, I mean, how do you deal with that breaking down when you know that you both want to be loving and not harm each other? You know, it's very very yeah. I mean, it just gets me thinking.
Yeah, we'll do that later, because in for example, spaces around like refugee studies or other kind of human rights, which are the two areas that really that I've worked on, it's very much the same, right? Because even in the human rights field, you have groups who will say, you're imposing these Western liberal ideals on us, and, you know, we have the right to refuse them, etc. And then, like, kind of, it's almost like cats screeching at each other, right? And there's no, and I think this is why I reference the conditions under which the independent investigation of truth have to be there in order for points of unity to be found. Nevertheless, because the world is at its stage of immaturity in a sense, and individuals also reflect that immaturity, we all do, like all the time. I mean, we're human, and we'll have our moments where things will like tick us off, or like it'll challenge us, and there's like a visceral reaction to it. Like if someone came up to me and just said, like, you're dumb, you don't know anything, I don't know, like everything you believe is just fake, and naturally there'll be something in me that will trigger. But then it's like you pull out all these tools. You can pull out all your like spiritual battle tools, you know, be like, all right, where's that love? Where's that kindness? Where's that overlooking the faults of others? Where's compassion and empathy for a person's condition, and what have they experienced where that would be what they would say? And then, okay, what environments are conducive to truth seeking and which ones are not? So where can you not be patronizing, paternalistic, all of these sorts of things, or adversarial, which is also big in the legal world and in politics, where it's adversary is the default. That's the expected like nature of being. Maybe we can chat more.
I think this I think the most interesting I found the most interesting things that I find out is so about the unity of humans. I think this is very hard because it's you see there's a different critical theories in this world. I mean, there's different government have its own self principles, but I do think because I read some of the materials about this, so I do think the structure of these modern government and the structure of modern government itself is designed to keep us in the not very unity. It is designed to make us the humanity divided, because all this, you see all these political theories, they all promoting us to divide each other, and they all fight against each other. You see this in the Western world, and this is the Western liberty, Western liberties. They see the democracy values, and they think they spare the democracy value to all the world, and they think every country to be like a democracy. And all you see in the East, the country in the East, this country like China or something, and they say no, we do socialism. China's like socialism, and we should every country should be in the socialism. And also you see this Islamic world. I mean and you understand they use some of the religion principle, and they say no, every place should be Islam. I mean, so all this, so it's designed to be like this. It's not just what it's not very simple. I mean, yeah.
So is the examples of Abdul Baha, I think mentioned, I don't know how familiar with Abdul Baha. And this is especially here because this is the 100th year of the passing of Abdul Baha. He passed away in November 1921. And he's a very special figure, not just for the Baha'is, but for the world, because he was one of the prophet founder of the faith, Baha'u'llah. But most of his life, he was in prison in company of his father, because his father was feared, because of his teachings, advanced teachings. So he was exiled from different places. And so he basically grew up in prison, and in concept. But after he was released towards the end of his life, he traveled throughout Europe and America. And so this person who has spent most of his life in prison, now he's actually being invited by universities like Stanford. He's invited by groups like the Peace Society in New York, by the philanthropists like Andrew Carnegie. All these very important people are actually coming to hear him. And it's very interesting. I think the example you said, and his teachings was very different from the thinking of that time. If you think about the 1912, 2 years before the First World War, there was so much pride in the progress of industry, the progress of the art in Europe. It was the golden years of Europe. Everyone was so excited about that. And nobody would think that any war is in sight. 2 years before that, actually celebrated. They created a peace palace in Hague in honor of lasting peace. But when he spoke, he didn't actually hide away his thinking. He said that this is great. I praise you for all that you have done. Your sciences, your industry, your cities, your architecture. But the source of war is not the agreements and treaties that you have signed, because they were very firm that they have signed so many treaties at that time. There was no, so he started disagreeing with them in a very loving language. So, but the source of the war, the cause of the war is not the treaties, is not the sides, it's the prejudices. Until and unless those disappear, you will see wars. And he clearly told them. And even after the First World War, told them, you have seen this tragedy, this catastrophe, but still you haven't learned that lesson. So he's telling the kings of the world, he wrote to the presidents, to the kings of the world, and he told them, all this armament you're collecting, this all it needs is a small ignition. And I pray to God that it won't happen, because the whole world is in trouble. Nobody had the concept of the World War. There was never a World War before. Because he knew the source of that. So I think that the way he talked to people different from his way of thinking. A person who was not formally educated. He praised them, he agreed with them, and then disagreed with them. and lovingly. And what he advised Baha'is is that when you come in this kind of situation, you say what is necessary to say, but then love them, love your hearer, and go and pray for them. That's simple. So this is the spirit of things. You said, if you look at everything scientifically, bringing sometimes arguments, they don't work. I've seen that in my work.
A practical tool though, is consultation, which is also a whole nother session that we could have on what are sort of the principles and the frameworks and the approaches to Baha'i consultation, where there's certain attitudes and skills that are needed and need to be present in order for. So there's a very classic quote. Classic is just, because it's used a lot, is that from the clash of differing opinions, a spark of truth will appear. And so people are like, well, what do you mean? If I've got two opinions that aren't the same, why would they clash and truth come? It's, again, disclaimer, if there are certain conditions in place, if the attitude of the listener and the speaker are one and the same, that you're seeking truth, then the different opinions is not the problem. Of course, we all have differing opinions, we have different experiences, but it's a part of, anyway, and you can develop the skill, and in marriage and in family and in work, you need to learn how to consult properly, otherwise it's clash, right? So it's not just at how do you speak to policymakers.
What you just said, like you just touched on it again, it's the investigation of truth. Genuinely trying to understand the response of the other person and letting them walk down to hear that person, they'll eventually come to a point of reasoning, right? Because there's always a triggered emotional response, like Kat said, you say something, I don't like, I say, and if you're genuinely not ready to listen, to accept something, how could you ever get your opinion heard or accepted, ever? You have to be willing to go into that conversation to learn something new and walk away from the conversation, not just put your point across and leave. Like Humby said, you can always go in.
Yeah, that's right. I think there is a case that you have to accept that there are situations. Actually, this is part of my work. I work in the conflict resolution using a special methodology, and but there is there's a big
very situation.
Today, I think it's more life, more lifestyle we live in. It is very a part of us from the so pictures and our life, so it's pretty much a part now. But before like technology stuff doesn't really drop and doesn't really have much of the that state. So the humans and the nature is more that part before. When you see before so many years ago, you see our ancestors live. They don't have cell phones, and they don't have air conditioning, they don't have a laptop. They're doing that very naturally. I hear this.
They just make each other on the head.
Yeah, I see this there's no bad at all. But what really
there are a group of people who do that in America, Amish people, they have resigned. Yeah.
People live in different houses and they just drive on vehicles.
Life happened before cell phone. That's right. So I'm wondering if there are other questions we haven't heard from. William, have been quiet tonight. You're always very profound things.
I was just going to comment he brought up the idea of consultation and then talking about investigation of truth. And then the clash of opinions and stuff. And then he was talking about, Kaigo was talking about different sort of civilizations, China,
No, I'm talking about the modern
Islam,
Yeah, modern life.
civilizations, and then so then there was this clash of civilizations, dialogue between civilizations, and working through all of those sorts of macro global scale things as part of the work to achieve world unity, and it requires consultation at the basic level probably, and scaffolding that up to higher and higher levels to work through all the differences. Something like that, and sincere like actual interest in doing that rather than sort of like a pyramid state. Probably the worst example at the moment.
More we learn. And yeah, and otherwise we can continue over a cup of tea or water. And it's good. Yeah.
As simple as that might be, what has been effective for all of you in reconciling differences with other people? Like, actually, I'm just interested in that. Yeah, as individuals, with families, partners, the university, the workplace. But when you've been in a situation which is like a situation of confrontation, of tension, what has helped you actually be on good terms and be united? Yeah, something you were saying as well.
Okay. So one answer is evolving it from scratch. Any other?
I tend to listen really carefully. I have calmed myself and see what happens. At first I'm quiet. I'm completely listening to where they're coming from, and feel. I feel what's happening, and then that helps me put myself in their position. So that helps me see where they're coming from. What is it that is making them feel that way? If I feel that they have a point, I recognize it. If I feel that they have misjudged the situation, I speak up and I explain things from my point of view and from my perspective. And that has helped me because I think it helps us move along. I recognize the parts that I can make sense, and then I also recognize the parts that they might have overlooked. And I think
that helps as well if the other parties, they feel that you're receptive to them. If you're not completely like pushing them.
Probably, but that's genuine. That's really genuine. So I'm not involved in an act. I really want to see where they're coming from. So sometimes I think we've been in situations like, okay, says you were quiet for the first year. Why were you so quiet for the first year? But then that's what's happening. I'm just absorbing and completely seeing where they're coming from. And yeah.
Because often when there's conflict, it's feel like you have to be understood or loved or valued. Right? There's a deep lack there. And the listening is on your part, right? Because sometimes in conflict, the reason is conflict just not get it. You know, they always just understood what I knew, like I'm the knower, you're the ignorant, like da da da. And again, if we go back to this idea that truth is one, that there is truth that's outside or inside, depending on how you want to go. It's not ours. And this is something that unlikely will grow to great and great. And so that humility to say, I may not know, I may be wrong on something, I'm willing to listen. And then adapting, and that changes the strength of the engagement conversation. Often when there's like, you know, there's a hot time, so it's cool. I mean, to context. No, but we said the first ones that came to happen, also that Abraham always showed the utmost love, even to his greatest. One story that always touches my heart is he was walking in the streets, which is an old city in the present day Israel, Palestine, previously Palestine. And he was walking in the streets of Akkad, and there was an old lady who came with rocks in her hands, and she was throwing them at her. And to understand the context is that, you know, they had been, Abraham was, you know, as a figure, was accounted to all of the traditions and the authority of that place. So, you know, that's one of the greatest conflicts you could ever have. And here's this old woman, and she's throwing rocks at him. And the Baha'is around Abraham starting to get right ahead, you know, wanting to go and protect her, or to go and shoo the old woman away. All of them. Let her do what she believes is right in this lesson. Let her fulfill her desire with what she believes she did righteously. It doesn't mean that when we go and we should just let someone do them. He was a perfect exemplar of these teachings. So it's like his way of living is bigger than us. So I'm not saying we should go and let ourselves be hit by somebody. It's the spirit of which we take. Sometimes people do things, and sometimes what they do is actually sincere in their heart. They believe that this is the right thing to do, and sometimes we have to allow them to fulfill that, to know the wrong motive. Maybe they'll feel it through the tears that they see coming down, or whatever it might be.
I think so. Kat has already mentioned about how Abdul Baha used to, and I think so. Really for me, in daily life, you will come across of family or at your work, and I think so, some of the basic qualities which Kat has already touched upon is kindness, patience, and you also think about my inspiration comes from Baha'i writings, and looking at Abdul Baha and how he carried himself. And if I find myself often in like situation of conflict, and that moment, if I got into that argument, I would often go back and reflect on why did I say that and how would I have done it differently. I think so that's another piece to going back and reflecting on a lot of things. Why did you react in that manner? And what made you do that is also important. That is how it helps you change and go from there. And often in arguments, people go in with a mindset of my point is the right point or my way is the right way. And they just constantly keep on trying to prove it to the other person, which is the quality of what Shirley was mentioning was you're not listening. You're not listening to the other person, so you're missing that quality as well. So there are a lot of, and not saying that I have mastered it, because I often am in situations and I go back and reflect on things.
How do you keep that open space in yourself to not get more offended or, because I've definitely been that. It's been very passionate. And I'm reflecting, I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
I know I shut off and now I'm anxious and I don't know how to control this, but I'm really doing it. And I'm not saying that to me all the time, but
having that sense of you're doing bad.
Yes.
Even your attack is hard.
And what Catholic also mentioning about Abdullah and how he loved everyone, and one of the quotes which I love from Abdullah is, where there is love, there is always time. Profound and thinking of, and it's not an easy, you can't just expect speaking to a stranger in a situation of conflict and you'll be like, oh, I love this guy, or I love this person, and I wouldn't be saying anything, but it's a very difficult thing to do or carry yourself into that, obviously, and it's a gradual process of learning that you come to a situation, point where you would carry yourself or handle yourself better, in a better way.
Tongue is the lodestone of the hearts of men. It clotheth the words with meaning. It is the bread of the spirit. It is the fountain of the light of wisdom and understanding. So if we're seeking wisdom and understanding, but we don't come with a kindly tongue, our words are those, that poison that we were talking about earlier, then it won't affect the but of course, if we make mistakes, that's totally fine. We'll forgive and forget, like it's also fine.
One, accept that you might be wrong, So before you start, and don't get to start any serious arguments after 9 p.m. That's advice I can give. Even if they kill you, say, I'm not going to talk. Okay, let's go. That's the best thing we can do. Yeah, right.
We got 20 minutes.
Wonderful. Actually, this is very good because this session, we not only we had very high level, things, teachings and stories from the life of, Khatere, and also teachings of the faith, but we got, thanks to you guys, a very good practical example, because that's what is important. The Baha'i faith is very practical. It's very practical. It's not just a bunch of ideals, and if you read the history of the faith, there are thousands of examples of social cohesion, that how Baha'is in the most difficult and dangerous situations have dared to attempt to create social cohesion. I'll give you a couple of examples while the kettle is and one was, I was born in Iran, and if you imagine the Iran in the middle of the 19th century, it was a country that was exemplified by segregation, religious segregation, gender segregation, cultural segregation, and it was very dangerous, for people of this different religions to get together in the same room. You couldn't, and the minorities, you had Muslims was a major population, and then you had Baha'is, which is the second largest minorities, and then you have Christians, and then you have Jews, and then Zoroastrians. But you couldn't get together with this. And the other, the more serious one was men and women being the same meeting. And yet, under these conditions, Baha'is were the first group that formed schools, and the first schools for girls was formed by Baha'is under these conditions, where you couldn't actually bring boys together and have teachers that teach both of them. And then, so they moved against, if you like, the streams of the society and against it. And then they formed assemblies. Baha'i administration works at local, the elected bodies, every year. And men and women and different religions, they can participate. And for the first decades or so, where Baha'i women and men were getting together, it was actually that it started lots of rumors about the nature of Baha'is. I remember as kids, they were actually ridiculing us, say your men and women get together at night and we don't know what they're doing, because it wasn't common, that people, because these meetings, assemblies are met at home, people's home, like tonight, because of an assembly here tonight. But at that time, going back 100 years ago, Baha'is, this was totally counterculture and dangerous for people, for Baha'i, but they still did that. So despite this, they actually changed the culture of the society, you know, without greater society actually noticing that. So that's in Iran. In America, we're still, you know, America is grappling with racial prejudice. If go back 100 years, it was almost 100 years ago, May 1921. Abdul Baha, again, we mentioned Abdul Baha tonight because it's very appropriate. It's a year. He instructs one of the American Baha'is, who is a lady, was one of the members of high society in influential ladies in Washington, D.C. He asked him, now he's in Palestine, asking this American lady to organize the race, and we call it Race Amity Conference. The first race unity or amity conference was held at the instruction of Abdul Baha 100 years ago in America. 100 years ago. Look at what America is today. They're still discussing and grappling and arguing about race unity. And then that started, that inspired a number of other conferences that happened throughout America. So you see, Baha'is are going against the grain of society. And we're not afraid of that. Actually, we take a lot of comfort because that's what it takes. In South Africa, you know, we had local assemblies, but Baha'is were not allowed for the black and white Baha'is to meet in the same assembly. What do? They do it anyway, against the odds of being arrested, you know. So these are the social activism, if you like, in a way, but very peaceful. The Baha'is are very, very peaceful. They never take, you know. So I think that's what everything that Father said. They're great examples of action, faith in action. And that's what is happening around the Baha'i world, you know. So you can talk to any of your friends, you know. Around the world, Baha'i world, millions of community building exercises for bringing not just Baha'i kids, Baha'i junior, all kids. Whatever Baha'is do is not just for Baha'i community. They're not making a secure, inward, you know, happy, fun Baha'i community. Everything we do is for the whole world. What are we doing? We're building a new generation of people for prejudice-free. So kids who are going to these classes, you know, you went to Ruhi, but the kids go to junior youth classes, they go to children classes, and there are thousands of kids that are now being raised prejudice-free. It's much easier for them to remain prejudice-free than for me to struggle daily about my prejudices. So I think that's the practical basis. What you're doing, which is very important, because faith can be something, people think of faith something very personal, very sort of, I can share it, has nothing to do with society, has nothing to do with my action, it's something I do on a week, you know, I go to the church or I go to the mosque, that's the faith, definition of faith. Or I do, I don't know, fasting or same. But for the Baha'is, faith is actually something very practical. Whatever we do, it's a daily thing. It's a daily. So whatever Khatarajan said tonight, which was very profound, you know, is happening. It's being played out every day around the world. Go and examine it yourself.
I think everybody who's done everything most well enough nothing. Because of the worst, I was so many people. There's just nothing knowledge no. So many people say, oh, I read lots of books and I know lots of knowledge and I pretty much diagnose everything. But this guy doesn't know.
You know,
Nothing.
it's just, I know we want to go have tea and snacks, but just the last point, because my mom left. She was the last person.
No, there is one more. There is one more. There is one more.
That's us. No, she's gone. Just us. Oh, she's gone. Okay. Well, what I was going to say was my mother's father, well, actually, my maternal grandparents were illiterate their whole lives. And my grandfather was the first person to encounter the Baha'i faith in our family. And he, had it not been for him, like our entire lives would be different. And he had to, it was, I mean, if you want to talk countercultural, like he was an excellent example of that. But very briefly, the way he came to recognize the faith was that he had this corner shop. And at the time, there was a common practice where people would mix a expensive oil with a cheap oil and then package that cheap oil as the expensive oil, right? In a sense, they were just being dishonest and corrupt, which is a minor example of greater corruptions that we see all over the world. And this Baha'i entered his shop, thank God, and said to him, you know, hey, what religion are you? And my grandfather said, that's the weirdest question because everybody is Muslim, right? So he said, I'm Muslim, but then he asked the question, why? What are you? And he said, well, I'm a Baha'i. And my grandfather said, what is that? And in this man's unerring wisdom, really, he could recognize that my grandfather was illiterate. He knew that no amount of prophecy or rational argument is going to like convey the teachings to him. So he was like, how can I convey the spirit of the teaching? So this comes us back to the very beginning of tonight, right? What is the spirit of it? So he said, a Baha'i is someone who would never mix the weaker oil with the more expensive oil and claim it to be the first, right? And my grandfather said, then that's what I am. And that started a journey. Okay, so like, of course, his knowledge deepened and his understanding deepened, and the fruits of his search became evident as time went on. But that is the beginning. So it's not.
Was he saying that? Was he giving an analogy to say that the spirit behind is just
that there's such a degree of truthfulness and integrity and self-effacement that you would never put that prefer your brother over yourself. You would never prefer your own financial advancement, status, what ease, comfort over the well-being of others. That's how I've understood that at the time. But and that's exactly the point. Because truth is one. Truth is one. Because the spirit of
Yes, that's exactly correct. Religion is one. That's one of the teachings. There is only one religion.
All the such, so something it's a new